The hospital hallways had a sterile stillness at night, the kind that made every footstep feel intrusive, every breath a whisper too loud. I knew this because I had spent so many nights on the phone with Daniel while he paced the quiet corridors between surgeries. He was a surgeon, dedicated, brilliant, and more, absent. It wasn't always like this. When we first got married, he'd call me between surgeries, his voice warm with exhaustion but still carrying the lilt of love. I would sit curled up on our bed, twirling the hem of my nightgown, listening to him recount the mundane details of his day. Another appendectomy tonight. It was messy. The intern almost fainted. Did you have dinner? I'd ask, knowing the answer. A vending machine sandwich. That counts, right? We'd laugh, our conversations weaving a bridge between the distance his career put between us. But lately, the calls had become infrequent. At first, I brushed it off, schedules change, emergencies arise. He was a surgeon, his job was unpredictable. But then the silences stretched longer. The goodnight texts stopped coming. And the loneliness settled in my chest, heavy and unshakable. One evening, I called him after dinner, expecting the usual tired but loving voice on the other end. The phone rang. And rang. And rang. No answer. I tried again. Voicemail. By the third time, a tight knot of unease formed in my stomach. I told myself he was in surgery, that he'd call back when he could. He always did. Except, this time, he didn't. That night, sleep evaded me. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every unanswered call, every moment in the past few weeks when something had felt off. The times Daniel came home late and went straight to the shower. The way his phone never seemed to be left unattended anymore. How he used to call me first thing after scrubbing out of surgery, but now? Silence. The next morning, as Daniel got ready for his shift, I watched him from the doorway of our bedroom. His movements were the same, buttoning up his crisp white coat, adjusting the stethoscope around his neck, but I saw it now. A difference. Hey, I said casually, wrapping my arms around myself. You never called me back last night. He barely glanced at me while tying his shoes. Long night. A couple of emergency cases. I nodded, searching his face. You could have texted. He sighed and finally looked at me. I know. I was exhausted. I just crashed in the on-call room. Something in his tone made me feel silly for asking, like I was nagging him. But wasn't I allowed to be worried? Wasn't I supposed to be? I just miss talking to you, I admitted, my voice softer now. Daniel's expression shifted, just for a second. A flicker of guilt? Or was I imagining things? He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I know, love. Things have just been crazy at the hospital lately. I wanted to believe him. I really did. The doubt continued to gnaw at me over the next few days. Daniel still answered my calls sometimes, but never with the same enthusiasm. And more often than not, he simply didn't answer at all. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was overthinking. But when you've been with someone long enough, you just know when something changes. The final push came one afternoon when I decided, on a whim, to visit him at the hospital. The idea to visit Daniel at work came suddenly, almost impulsively. I told myself it was just to surprise him, to bring him a coffee and steal a few moments together. A small way to bridge the growing distance. But deep down, I knew better. I needed to see for myself. By the time I reached the hospital, my heart was pounding in my chest. The smell of antiseptic and faint traces of coffee lingered in the air as I walked through the lobby. I had been here before, many times, actually, but today, something felt different. The walls seemed taller, the fluorescent lights harsher, and the people walking past me were just shadows in motion. I approached the reception desk and gave the nurse my best polite smile. Hi, I'm here to see Dr. Daniel Carter. He's my husband. She nodded, clicking away at her keyboard. He should be on the surgical floor. Do you know which department he's in right now? I hesitated. I didn't. I used to. Another nurse, an older woman with kind eyes, looked up. Dr. Carter? I think he's in the cardiology wing today. But he might be in a patient consult. I nodded, thanked them, and headed for the elevator, clutching the coffee cup a little tighter. As I stepped onto the surgical floor, I noticed how familiar yet foreign it felt. Nurses hurried by with clipboards, doctors spoke in hushed tones, and machines beeped rhythmically from nearby rooms. I scanned the area, my stomach twisting in knots. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the nurses, Amanda, if I remembered her name correctly, wasn't at her station. She was always there. In fact, I had met her a few times before when I visited Daniel in the past. I turned to another nurse nearby. Hi, do you know where Nurse Amanda is? The woman barely looked up from her chart. Oh, she's with Dr. Carter. They're examining a patient. The explanation was simple. Innocent. Logical. So why did my breath hitch? I almost turned away, ready to let it go, when something caught my eye. The door to the on-call room was slightly ajar. Just enough to see inside. Just enough to see them. Daniel. Amanda. Their bodies too close. His hands on her waist. Her fingers tracing the collar of his white coat. I froze. My mind tried to make sense of it, tried to find a reason that wasn't the obvious truth, but there was no mistaking the way he leaned into her, the way her lips ghosted over his jawline. The coffee cup slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. And in that moment, Daniel turned. Our eyes met. And everything shattered. For a moment, time stopped. The sounds of the hospital, distant beeping monitors, murmured voices, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, faded into silence. Daniel's face drained of color the instant he saw me. Amanda stepped back, her fingers still lightly touching his coat, her eyes wide with guilt. I felt frozen, my body unwilling to move, to react, to accept what my brain had already processed. His hands. On her waist. Their closeness. The intimacy. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Emily, Daniel said, stepping toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a step back. It was automatic, instinctive. Like my body knew before my mind did that I couldn't let him touch me. Amanda's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but she remained silent. What could she possibly say? What excuse could there be? My voice, when I finally found it, was quiet but steady. How long? Daniel blinked. What? I swallowed against the lump in my throat. How long has this been going on? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The guilty look in his eyes told me everything. It's not what you think. A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat. Not what I think. I gestured between them, my voice rising. So you weren't just, I stopped, shaking my head. Don't lie to me, Daniel. Not now. Amanda, to her credit, had the decency to step away completely, pressing herself against the back wall as if trying to disappear. I turned to her, my anger barely contained. You work with him. You know he's married. My voice wavered, emotions threatening to spill over. Did you even care? She looked down, shame flickering across her face. I didn't mean. But I didn't want her apologies. I didn't want excuses. I wanted the truth. From him. I turned back to Daniel. You owe me an answer. He sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. A few months. The words felt like a physical blow. I actually took another step back, as if distance would lessen the impact. Months. While I had been home alone, waiting for his calls. While I had been missing him, worrying about him. While I had been blaming myself for our growing distance. His silence. His late nights. His phone always locked. It all made sense now. My stomach twisted painfully. So all those nights you didn't pick up my calls, you were with her? Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was answer enough. I clenched my hands into fists, trying to steady myself. I wouldn't let him see me break. Not here. Not now. Emily, he tried again, softer this time, as if that would make it better. I never meant for you to find out this way. A hollow laugh escaped me. Oh. And how exactly were you planning on telling me? Silence. That was what I thought. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. My heart was shattering, my world tilting, but I refused to fall apart in front of them. With as much dignity as I could muster, I turned on my heel and walked away. Daniel didn't chase after me. And somehow, that hurt most of all. I walked out of the hospital in a daze, my feet moving on instinct while my mind tried to catch up with what had just happened. Daniel. Amanda. Months. I kept repeating it in my head, like I could somehow make sense of it if I said it enough times. But the more I thought about it, the worse it got. I made it to my car, gripping the handle to steady myself. My breathing was uneven, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys. I felt like I was going to be sick. How had I been so blind? Sliding into the driver's seat, I stared blankly at the steering wheel. I wasn't ready to drive yet. My hands felt numb, my thoughts racing too fast. Had I missed the signs? Or had I seen them all and just refused to believe it? The late nights. The missed calls. The sudden distance. I had been waiting for him. Loving him. Defending him in my own mind, convincing myself that he was just busy, that work was draining him. Meanwhile, he was with her. A sharp sob tore through my chest before I could stop it. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to muffle the sound, but it was no use. The dam had broken. Tears streamed down my face, hot and relentless. My body shook as I gasped for breath, the weight of betrayal settling deep in my bones. He lied to me. I had trusted Daniel with everything, with my heart, my love, my life. And he had thrown it away like it meant nothing. I didn't know how long I sat there, crying in my car outside the hospital. Time blurred, my thoughts spiraling. But one thing became clearer with every tear that fell. I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend this never happened. I couldn't be the woman who ignored the truth just to keep the illusion of a marriage intact. A deep, shuddering breath passed through my lips. I deserved better. I wiped my tears away, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain. Daniel had just lost me forever. The drive home was quiet, except for the occasional sniffle that escaped me. My hands were steady now, but my heart still pounded like a war drum inside my chest. I should have been raging, screaming, breaking things, but all I felt was hollow. The house was dark when I walked in, just as I had left it. It felt different now, like a stranger's home rather than my own. Every framed photo, every piece of furniture, it all belonged to the life I thought I had. A life that didn't exist anymore. I dropped my purse by the door and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water with shaking hands. My reflection in the window above the sink startled me. I looked wrecked. Red, swollen eyes. Mascara smudged in uneven streaks. I didn't recognize myself. My phone buzzed against the countertop, and my stomach twisted painfully. Daniel. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the device. My heart screamed at me to pick up, to demand answers, to make him explain. But I already knew everything I needed to. He cheated. He lied. He chose her. I let the call ring out. A few seconds later, my voicemail chimed with a new message. I hesitated before pressing play. Emily, please, just call me back. We need to talk. His voice sounded off. Not frantic. Not remorseful. Just tired. I should have felt anger. Instead, I felt nothing. A few moments later, another text popped up. Daniel, I'm coming home soon. Please don't shut me out. I let out a hollow laugh. Shut you out? He had already shut me out the moment he touched another woman. I turned my phone over, ignoring the ache in my chest. I refused to let him control this narrative. I refused to let him talk his way out of what I saw with my own eyes. I needed time to think. To breathe. To figure out what came next. I had never imagined my life without Daniel. But now, for the first time, I had to. And I had no idea where to start. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in endless circles. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Daniel and Amanda, tangled in a moment that should have belonged to us. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. At some point, exhaustion took over. But it wasn't restful sleep, it was fractured, filled with restless tossing and turning. When I woke, the morning light streamed through the curtains, but it did nothing to warm the cold space beside me. Daniel wasn't home yet. Part of me wanted to pack a bag and leave before he got here, to spare myself the pain of looking him in the eyes again. But another part of me, the part that had fought for our marriage, wanted answers. I deserved that much. By noon, I heard the front door unlock. The sound made my heart pound, and I gripped the mug of coffee in my hands tighter, trying to steady myself. I wouldn't let him see me break. Not again. Daniel stepped into the living room cautiously, like a man walking into his own execution. His hair was messier than usual, his scrubs slightly wrinkled. He had the audacity to look nervous. He set his bag down by the door. Emily. I exhaled through my nose. I hope she was worth it. He winced. Can we not do this like? No, I cut him off sharply, standing up. You don't get to control this conversation. I saw you, Daniel. I saw everything. His jaw tightened. It wasn't what it looked like. I laughed, actually laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. Oh. So you weren't touching her? She wasn't running her hands all over you? I took a step forward, my voice dangerously low. Don't lie to me again. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked like the man I used to love, the man I had built a life with. But now, I wasn't sure if I even knew who that man was anymore. It wasn't serious, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear. It was a mistake. A mistake. Like he had tripped and fallen into an affair. I shook my head, something inside me snapping. You don't get to decide that, Daniel. You don't get to downplay what you did. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. You destroyed us. Silence stretched between us. His eyes flickered with something, regret? Guilt? But whatever it wasn't enough. I waited for him to fight for me. For us. But he just stood there. And that was the moment I knew. There was nothing left to save. I took a deep breath, my voice steady. I want a divorce. Daniel's face paled. Emily. I turned away. Get your things. I want you gone by tonight. His protests faded into the background as I walked away, feeling the weight of my decision settle into my bones. It hurt. It ached. But for the first time in a long time, I was choosing myself. And that had to count for something. The silence after Daniel left was deafening. No footsteps echoing down the hall. No late-night phone calls from the hospital. No quiet laughter from the other room when he was watching something on his phone. Just, nothing. I stood in the doorway, staring at the space he had just vacated, trying to process what had just happened. The house, our home, felt emptier than it ever had before. And yet, for the first time in months, I could breathe. Daniel had tried to reason with me before he left. "We can go to counseling, Emily." It didn't mean anything. "I don't want to lose you." But all of it felt hollow. Because he had already lost me. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself sitting on the couch, curled up with a blanket, staring blankly at my phone. A dozen unread messages from friends and family who had no idea my world had just imploded. I knew I should tell someone. But where would I even start? "Hey, Mom. Daniel's been cheating on me for months, and I caught him in the hospital with another woman. Anyway, how was your day?" I let out a humorless laugh, rubbing at my temple. Instead, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do since I first walked into that hospital. I let myself grieve. I grieved the love I had believed in. The trust one had so freely given. The marriage I had thought was unshakable. Tears slipped down my face, but I didn't fight them. This time, I let them fall. Because this was the end of us. And I had to mourn it. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I wouldn't let this break me. I would call a lawyer. I would tell my family. I would move forward, without him. For years, I had been Daniel's wife. Supporting his career. Loving him. Waiting for him. But now? It was time to choose me. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long streaks of gold across the bedroom floor. The bed was half empty, his side cold, untouched. I should have felt relief. Instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Divorce. The word sat heavy in my chest, pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake. I had said it, declared it, but now came the reality. The paperwork, the conversations, the slow unraveling of a life we had built together. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move. The first call I made was to a lawyer. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I had to start somewhere. The receptionist's voice was calm, professional, as she scheduled my consultation. "You're making the right decision," she had said before hanging up. Was I? I wasn't doubting myself, I knew I could never stay. But I had spent so long as Daniel's wife that I wasn't sure who I was without him. So I started small. I stripped the bed, tossing the sheets into the washer. I packed up some of his things, shoving them into a box by the door. I deleted our last photo together from my phone. Each action felt like cutting a thread, unraveling the bond we once shared. But I wasn't ready for the next part. Telling people. I stared at my phone, scrolling through my contacts. Who did I call first? My mom? My best friend? Would I cry? Would they say, "I told you so"? Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed dial. My mother answered on the second ring. "Emily? Honey, it's early." I opened my mouth, but my voice caught. "How do you say, my marriage is over?" Somehow, she knew. Maybe it was the silence, maybe it was the way my breathing wavered. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice full of understanding. "Tell me what happened." And so, I did. I told her everything, from the missed calls to the late nights, to the moment I saw Daniel in the on-call room with her. My voice cracked, but I didn't fall apart. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then she said the one thing I needed to hear. "I'm proud of you." A tear slipped down my cheek, but this time, it wasn't from heartbreak. It was from strength. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew I was going to be okay. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and emotions that swung between sadness and quiet determination. I met with the lawyer. I told my closest friends. I began to unravel the life Daniel and I had built together, thread by thread, piece by piece. And through it all, he barely tried to stop me. There were no grand gestures, no pleas for a second chance. Just a few empty apologies and an acceptance that this was happening. Maybe that hurt more than anything, the realization that I had been holding on to something he was ready to let go of. By the end of the week, I had packed up the last of his things. The box by the door sat like a final period at the end of our story. And then, just as I was about to move on with my day, there was a knock. I knew before opening it that it was him. Daniel stood there, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His eyes were tired, his shoulders hunched forward like the weight of his choices had finally settled on him. I didn't speak first. He exhaled, glancing at the box. So that's it, then. I crossed my arms. Yes. That's it. A pause. He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he nodded, as if accepting his own defeat. I never wanted to hurt you, Emily. I let out a breath, not anger, not sadness. Just finality. But you did. And with that, I stepped back and closed the door. For the first time in weeks, in months, I felt free. No more waiting by the phone. No more making excuses for his absence. No more fighting for someone who had already chosen someone else. I wasn't broken. I wasn't ruined. I was free. That night, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, I realized something. This wasn't the ending I had imagined for my life. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better.